All right, today we're diving into the Gospel of Mark. And let me tell you, this isn't just any story. It's a really unique and powerful account of Jesus' life, and it's known for its direct, almost breathless, fast-paced style. So let's get into what makes it so gripping. So let's start with a crazy thought. What if the most important story ever told was written like an action movie? Seriously, that's kind of the lens we need to look at the Gospel of Mark through. It's a story that grabs you from the very first scene and just does not let go. So, what really sets Mark apart from the other Gospels? Well, if you look at Matthew or Luke, you get these long, beautiful teachings, right? Like the Sermon on the Mount. Mark is different. It's the shortest of the four, probably written somewhere between 60 and 70 AD, and it is all about action. The story moves at this breakneck speed, focusing way more on what Jesus did than on long speeches about what he said. And that brings us to the first big chunk of the story. Right from the get-go, Mark shows us a Jesus who is just bursting with power. But he's also surrounded by this really fascinating air of mystery. The action starts immediately. You've got this incredible scene where some friends are so desperate to get their paralyzed buddy to Jesus that they literally tear a hole in a roof and lower him down. But here's the twist. Jesus doesn't just heal him. The first thing he says is, "Your sins are forgiven." You can imagine the shock from the religious leaders. So to prove he has the authority to do both, Jesus then tells the man to get up and walk. Right away, we see his power over everything, the spiritual and the physical. And his authority isn't just over people. Oh no, get this. He's on a boat with his disciples. A huge, violent storm kicks up. And these guys, seasoned fishermen, are terrified for their lives. Jesus just stands up, looks at the storm, and tells the wind and the waves to be still. And they do. They just obey him. Mark is showing us a power that completely defies the laws of nature. And the miracles, they just keep coming, one right after another. Mark tells this amazing story of a crowd of over 5,000 people stranded with nothing to eat. And with just this tiny meal, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, Jesus feeds every single one of them. It's this incredible display of not just his power, but his deep compassion for people. But here's where we hit this central tension that Mark builds so well. After all these incredible things, Jesus often pulls people aside and says, "Hey, don't tell anyone who I am." It's this thing scholars call the Messianic secret. And you have to wonder, why? Why would someone so powerful want to keep his identity hidden? Well, it builds suspense, for sure. But it also seems like Mark is trying to completely redefine what the word Messiah even means. He's steering the audience away from the idea of a political, conquering king to something totally different. It forces us to ask, who is this man, and what is he really here to do? And that very question leads us right to the turning point of the entire gospel. Right around the halfway mark, everything shifts, the frantic pace slows way down, and the focus changes from what Jesus can do to who he must become. The big moment, the pivot point, comes when Jesus finally just asks his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" And it's Peter who steps up and finally says what they've all been thinking. He declares, "You are the Messiah." The secret is out, at least within that inner circle. And that one confession, it's the hinge on which the entire rest of the story turns.
But, and this is a huge but, the second that revelation is out in the open, Jesus just completely shatters their expectations. See, his disciples were thinking conquering king. They were hoping for a Messiah who would use his power to overthrow their oppressors. Instead, Jesus lays out a totally different reality. He has to be a suffering servant. His path doesn't lead to a throne, but to sacrifice and ultimately to his own death.
From this moment on, the whole tone of the gospel changes. Jesus starts teaching that if you want to follow him, you have to take up your own cross. You have to embrace a path of sacrifice and put God before everything else. Now, this radical idea that real power is found in serving and victory is found in sacrifice, that only ramps up the opposition from the religious leaders who see him as a growing threat. All of this tension, all this buildup, it all leads to the climax of the story. The final section of Mark barrels through the dramatic, tragic, and, in the end, triumphant events of Jesus' last days in Jerusalem. Mark recounts these final events with that same speed and intensity we saw at the beginning. At the Last Supper, Jesus sets up a new covenant.
Then he's betrayed, arrested. He goes through a series of corrupt trials, is mocked, beaten, and finally executed on a cross, the ultimate act of the suffering servant. But that's not where the story ends. 3 days later, some women go to his tomb to anoint his body, and they find it empty.
And this brings up a really fascinating question that people have debated for centuries. Because you see, in the oldest copies of this gospel we have, the ending is, well, it's incredibly abrupt. So where does the story really end? Okay, so here's the deal. The earliest and most reliable manuscripts of Mark just stop right at chapter 16, verse 8. The women find the empty tomb, an angel tells them Jesus is risen, and they run away in terror and amazement, telling no one, and that's it, the end. It's sudden, it's mysterious. Now, later manuscripts add what's called the longer ending, which tacks on resurrection appearances and the Great Commission, making it sound a lot more like the other Gospels. Most scholars think this was probably added later by scribes to give the story a more satisfying, less jarring conclusion. But you know, whether you read the short, abrupt ending or the longer, more conclusive one, the Gospel of Mark leaves us with a really profound message and a final, lingering question. So let's just recap the big takeaways here. Mark gives us a Messiah who is this incredible mix of power and sacrifice. He shows he has total authority over nature, sickness, the spiritual world, and even death itself. But his road to victory isn't through conquest, it's through the cross, teaching that true, authentic power is actually found in serving others. In the end, Mark's gospel is this powerful, challenging picture of a Messiah who is defined by both his actions and his sacrifice. It really forces us to look at our own expectations of what power and leadership should look like. And it leaves us with this final thought. What does this urgent, intense, and surprising story mean for us today?